totalitarian tiptoe, a bit more. The ID cards are the stepping stone to that. And this, the taser. When this came out, the taser, 55,000 volts these unleashed from policemen on their targets. They said they're only going to be used, this is not long ago either, by the way, they're only going to be used by people trained in firearms. I said on my website, that day, these are going to be given to every police officer. They're now going to be given to every police officer. Why? Because I remember a headline from a guy who saw one of these working, a journalist, and the headline was, "Anything you say, officer, just don't use that thing on me." That's what they're about. You've got some brain donor in a uniform who hasn't got two brain cells to rub together. They're not all like that. There are many honourable exceptions, but some are. And you give them 55,000 volts they can legally unleash against you. Big brother, bloody hell. I saw this. Fascism. You really think it's going to be this obvious? It's being brought in covertly, but it's reached the point where increasingly it is becoming that obvious. The secret agenda and the movie justifying the agenda is what this Big Brother debate in this by-election ought to be about. But it's not. Now, this may not seem, this next little section here, that it relates to this by-election, but it bloody well does. No need for prophecy. It's written down. In the year 2000, in America, an organization set up in the 90s by the people who controlled and control the Bush administration this last 8 years was set up. It was called the Project for the New American Century. And it was created by people who have since become known as neocons or neoconservatives. September 2000 they published this, and it was called Rebuilding America's Defenses, Strategies, Forces and Resources for a New Century. This is what it said. I'll come to that. These are three main people who were in the creation of the Project for the New American Century. Dick Cheney, Vice President, more power than the President. Donald Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary at the time of 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. Paul Wolfowitz, Defense Deputy Secretary at the same time. These are some of the other neocons. Michael Ledeen connects into the fascist network in Italy, an associate of a guy called Licio Gelli, who ran the P2 Freemasonry Lodge that was behind the Vatican Bank scandal that led to a guy called Roberto Calvi being hung under London Bridge over the Thames. Richard Pearl, one of the major architects acknowledged in the mainstream media of the invasion of Iraq and the war on terror. John Bolton, ditto. Douglas Feith, ditto. Jeb Bush, brother of the president. William Crystal, editor of the Murdoch Weekly Standard, a neocon paper in Washington, and one of the major advocates in the media of the invasion of Iraq and the war on terror. This is what it said, that document, September 2000. It called for American armed forces, it called the American armed forces the cavalry on the new American frontier. He said that key allies like the United Kingdom are the most effective and efficient means of exercising American global leadership. That's not happened, has it? The United States has for decades sought to play a more permanent role in Gulf regional security, brackets control. While the unresolved conflict with Iraq provides the immediate justification, the need for a substantial American force presence in the Gulf transcends the issue of the regime of Saddam Hussein. It was an excuse to get in there. They ain't coming out. No intention, as I said from the start. It called for a blueprint for maintaining global US preeminence, in other words, the shadow network's preeminence through America, and shaping the international security order in line with America's principles and interests. See before. This American grand strategy must be advanced as far into the future as possible, and the US must fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theatre wars as a core mission. September 2000. Look what's happened since. It says that peacekeeping missions demand American political leadership rather than that of the United Nations. Happened. It highlights North Korea, Syria, Iran and Libya as dangerous regimes, target for takeover or control, and says their existence justifies the creation of a worldwide command and control system, World Army. This man, David Frum, who is a scholar of an organization called the American Enterprise Institute, which is a neocon operation that fits like that into the project for the new American century, was the man who wrote the famous State of the Union speech for Bush, I think it was in 2002, in which he said that there was an axis of evil that had to be targeted. What was that axis of evil? Iraq, Iran, North Korea, straight off the pages of the Project for the New American Century document. It spotlights China for regime change. This is where it's leading. They want a conflict with China for a massive global problem which will bring in the global solution, the world government and the world army, to stop it ever happening again, even though they created it in the first place. I've been talking about this now since the mid-1990s, the China thing, and in 2000 they come out and actually say it. It is time for the presence of American forces in Southeast Asia, it says. This could lead to American and Allied power providing the spur to the process of democratization in China. These people are crazy, but not stupid. It called for the creation of US space forces to dominate space and total control of cyberspace to prevent their enemies using the internet, i.e. people like me and others who are exposing this. They're trying to more and more edit and censor the internet. Talks of developing biological, but these are the people we're talking about here, who are saving us from terrorists. Talks of developing biological weapons that can target specific genotypes. This may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. And this is what it said in that document when it was saying that there was a problem with introducing this agenda because the people wouldn't have it. And this is what it said in terms of the timescale of this agenda. The process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Let's have that again. This process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. 1 year after that document was published, 9 months after the people that wrote it came to power in the Bush administration, America had what Bush described at the time as our Pearl Harbor. And everything that has happened since 9/11, that has unfolded off the pages of that document quite demonstrably, has been justified by 9/11. Problem, reaction, solution. And no mainstream journalist has even thought of questioning the official version of 9/11. And we are being told by the left in politics, by often the Greens, though not all of them, I'm talking about the hierarchy, that Bush and Blair lied about everything. Beliar, you remember the posters? Those two lied about everything except the official story of 9/11. They told the whole truth about that in terms of how it was orchestrated. Naivety Anonymous, hello, is that you? I've got some customers for you. And they condemn people like me for having the nerve to raise the subject. Nutter, rubbish. Oh, God. I wrote a book a year, well actually I wrote it immediately after 9/11 and researched it for a year. It came out a year to the month after 9/11. It takes the official story apart. It's a fairy tale. A fairy tale. But it's been justified. It's used to justify this, and that's why it happened. Bullshit. Absolutely. The official story of 9/11 has just left the room. Even academics that rubbished it to start with are saying the official story doesn't make sense. You've got pilot organizations that are saying, pilots against 9/11 and stuff, who are saying there's no way those people who couldn't fly Cessnas could do what they did with those planes. Endless people now. There are engineers organizations against 9/11 who are pointing out that those buildings could never have collapsed as they did because of fire and steel. But no one investigates it. You know, tonight, I think it's at 9 o'clock on BBC Two, we're going to have another farce from the BBC trying to explain why the third building on 9/11, Building 7, collapsed in a mirror of a controlled demolition. And they've taken 7 years and have not yet come up with an explanation for it. And as a result of 9/11, Cheney said it's going to be a long, dirty war against the terrorists. What about a war on terrorism? What does that have that wars between countries don't have? It doesn't have an end that you can point to and say it's over. How do you know when a war on terrorism is over? You don't. That's the idea. That's why they've gone for this. And these are the people protecting us from terrorism. This is John Negroponte, the UN ambassador who was arguing in the UN for the invasion of Iraq. And this is what John Pilger wrote in the New Statesman magazine. How appropriate that John Negroponte is Bush's ambassador at the United Nations. This week he delivered America's threat to the world that it may require to attack more and more countries. As US ambassador to Honduras in the early 1980s, Negroponte oversaw American funding of the regime's death squads, known as Battalion 316, that wiped out the democratic opposition while the CIA ran its Contra war of terror against the neighbouring Nicaragua. Murdering teachers and slitting the throats of midwives were a speciality. What did Negroponte go on to be? The man who was the head of US operations in Iraq after the invasion and then head of the whole of US intelligence for a while. These are the people protecting us from terrorists. These are the people that operate here and provide the excuses here. We must get bin Laden. Oh, really? Oh, yeah. Well, why haven't they got bin Laden? They've got satellite technology that can read your number plate from space. Oh, I've got the number plate, mate. I can't see it. He ain't got a beard. He ain't got a beard. Can't find bin Laden. This is from a Newsnight documentary. For people watching this on the internet, it's a current affairs programme in Britain. A guy called Greg Palast is an American journalist, and as journalists go, he's well ahead of your normal mainstream journalist. He said in Saudi Arabia, this is a quote that was from Michael Springman, US consulate in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, that was on the programme. He was in that position when Father Bush was president. In Saudi Arabia, I was repeatedly ordered by high-level State Department officials to issue visas to unqualified applicants. These were essentially people who had no ties either to Saudi Arabia or to their own country. I complained bitterly at the time there. I returned to the US, I complained to the State Department here, to the General Accounting Office, to the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, and to the Inspector General's office. I was met with silence. What I was protesting was, in reality, an effort to bring recruits rounded up by Osama bin Laden to the US for terrorist training by the CIA. They would then be returned to Afghanistan to fight against the then Soviets, which I mentioned earlier. And this is Palast on the same document or the same report on the programme. I received a phone call from a high-placed member of a US intelligence agency. He tells me that while there's always been constraints on investigating Saudis, under George Bush it's gotten much worse. After the elections, the agencies were told to back off investigating the bin Ladens and Saudi royals, and that angered agents. Why? Because the Bush family were connected into the bin Laden family in ways I describe in my books, and it was one of those to create the war on terror. This is the late Robin Cook, just before he died. Throughout the night, he was one time Foreign Secretary in Britain. Throughout the 1980s, bin Laden was armed by the CIA and funded by the Saudis to wage jihad against the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda, literally the database, was originally the computer file of the thousands of mujahideen who were recruited and trained with the help of the CIA to defeat the Russians. As I said earlier, in other words, they were creating the terrorists to frighten the people with, to justify the introduction of the Big Brother state. David Davis Shami Chakrabarti of Liberty, wake the hell up! Because they don't want to know about this.